Storyline subscribers, this is week number 2 in our experimental processed series. We are going to be talking about our double fermented Colombia. I'm super excited about this coffee, so let's not waste any time. First thing we're going to talk about just a general overview of the coffee and what to expect from it. It is a Caturra varietal and it is from Colombia. There are 2 women producers on this, Gladys and Alexandra, and they have done an amazing, Gladys and Sandra have done an amazing job on this coffee. It is fermented twice. The first fermentation process is a carbonic maceration. We'll dive into that further, but that is for 24 hours. The second is an anaerobic process, and that is for 28 hours, and it produces a really amazing cup. The tasting notes you're going to get out of this is going to be sweet cherry. You're going to get a lot of peach. You're also going to get a lot of strawberry notes, a lot of acidity on that front half with your citrus notes, and you're going to get a lot of caramel sweetness in there as well. So this is an incredibly complex and really tasty coffee, and that all comes about because of how it is processed. So it is incredibly good. Let's dive into the first section, which is the carbonic maceration of the processing note. Carbonic maceration is where the coffee cherry is put into a tank and allowed to ferment. Carbonic maceration, the carbonic means it's a carbon-rich environment. It's carbon-rich because when that yeast eats the sugars that are found in the coffee cherry, it off-gases carbon dioxide. When it's in a sealed tank, it's a very carbon-rich environment, and that is why you get the carbonic maceration. It's actually a wine term. For those of you who are wine drinkers, you may have heard of carbonic maceration from wine. That is why. So they're put in huge tanks. The coffee cherries are put in there. Now the selection process for this coffee is very meticulous. The 2 women producers have 170 different farmers that they only select the finest and ripest cherries because it has the highest sugar content. So in this first carbonic maceration processing, the very ripe cherries are placed into a tank. It is sealed, and they check the temperature and pH levels regularly to make sure that the fermentation does not take off. Because it's such a sugary rich environment with all of those cherries being added in, they only ferment it for 24 hours. The fermentation can take off very quickly in that time if the heat gets out of control, which is why they check it regularly. In the carbonic maceration, what you're going to get for the cup is the second thing we really want to dive into. So that sounds awesome and cool, but what is it actually going to do for the cup that I'm going to be drinking and tasting? The cup is going to be very sweet from this step 1, which is our carbonic maceration for 24 hours. The reason being is that yeast is going to be eating that sugar and pulling it and drawing it into that coffee bean, and it's going to get a very sweet cup. That fermentation is not adding anything unnatural to the coffee. It's just pulling into that cherry what's already there, and into that, from the cherry into the bean what's already there. So it's going to get a lot of sweetness. The sweetness is going to be tasted in that sweet cherry as well as a peach. Peaches are more of a sweet fruit. And you're also going to get a very complex coffee from this. And so the strawberry sometimes are sweeter, sometimes are tartar. In this, I'm tasting more of a tart cherry or a tart strawberry. So I think that'll be from our second step. But the sweetness is found in there, and that is from the carbonic maceration because of those tanks. After the 24 hours is done, they empty those tanks, they depulp the coffee, and that is where we start step 2. Step 2 is the anaerobic processing. So the cherries are depulped and removed, and that mucilage is left on there. The mucilage is that sticky, sugary substance that protects the bean, and that is what is going to allow the yeast to then ferment for the second time. They're placed back into a tank, sealed up, which is where you get the anaerobic, which ana means without, aerobic means oxygen. So without oxygen, that tank is sealed. There's a one-way valve. When that yeast eats the sugar, it again off-gases CO2. It is done for 28 hours. What is happening in this 28 hours is there's no more oxygen, and it's just going to off-gas CO2, but there's no cherry. So the difference between carbonic maceration and anaerobic is one has a cherry, one just has the mucilage. The mucilage is going to be very red, as you see in one of those photos on there. The reason that is because the yeast has already pulled a lot of those fruit notes and the sweetness from the cherry into the mucilage. Now the mucilage is just left there, and that is what is going to really impart your acidity and your fruit notes in this. It's done for 28 hours to give it balance. So we have a lot of sweetness right now. If we don't balance out some of that sweetness, it's going to be overpowering. So we're trying to bring out some of those fruit notes with this anaerobic processing methods. Which brings us to our second part. What does this do? It brings out a lot of fruit notes. Those fruit notes are going to be found within the strawberry, the cherry, as well as the peach. You're really going to taste that acidity also, because the acidity is really going to be pulled out in this anaerobic processing. So it's going to give a really complex, really juicy, really tasty cup of coffee, and that is because of this double fermentation process. So step one, they dump the cherries into it. It's carbonic macerated for 24 hours. They drop the water out of that. They depulp it. They put the mucilage into a tank with the beans. They allow it to ferment for 28 hours. Again, checking temperature and pH regularly to make sure that you don't get any off flavors if fermentation goes too long. And then it's dumped again. The beans are washed and they're dried for 17 days. This process is incredibly time consuming, and it has a lot of work and a lot of moving pieces to it. The selection and picking process is very extensive, which is why this coffee is so dang good. So that is kind of the overview of what we've got. Charles Hoffman is a coffee expert in England. Don't call me, he could be London, England. I'm not exactly sure. He has a cool accent, that's all I know. He has a really great brewing guide that I did for this coffee. Tried a lot of different brewing guides from different coffee experts to see which is going to be best for our double fermented Colombia, and I chose this one mainly because he goes a little finer on the grind setting, which I recommended last week, and he is an expert. It's incredibly good. So follow along each one of those steps. If you guys have any questions, the Slack group is a great way to reach out. Ask me questions, ask other people questions. If you're brewing and you're getting different notes that maybe some other people aren't, it could be because of your water, it could be because of a variety of different things, and we'll discuss all that and dive into it in the Slack group. It would mean a lot if you guys joined that group and hopped on. You guys can turn off notifications, join it when you want, but it is very exciting for what we have going on. Thanks so much for joining us. Have an amazing week. I hope you guys enjoyed your Easter with your family, and we are so grateful for each and every one of you. God bless.